So, spatial history is not one particular methodology or one theory, but it can employ any of the following. So, when we're thinking about spatial history in relationship to LGBTQ or drag communities, we want to be considering um, a large number of contextual factors. So, we can think about things like space, place, and time, but we need to be thinking about them together. So, this isn't suggesting that everyone who does this kind of research is going to be considering every factor at the same time, but the work that goes into thinking about geographies of sexuality um, is broadly interdisciplinary in academia. So you will find focus on things like within the social sciences, within anthropology, gender studies, um, other things like that that are within the humanities social science spectrum. And so broadly, they're all trying to access this meaning of space or place, the lived experience of space. So, how do people individually and collectively produce a sense of space? What kind of bonds are shared between people when people are within a particular space that has an affective meaning towards them? So, bounded places are fundamental in providing a sense of belonging for those who live in them. So this kind of proposes or prompts us rather to think about the dynamic relationship between the human body, between an identity group or a small collective and the spaces they inhabit, be it within positive or negative. So we can think about the gay bar, for example, as one of these affective spaces where it has a lot of meaning. There's its association with things like a safer space for queer LGBTQ people. And other spaces can have a lot of meaning, but it can be maybe focused on things like trauma. So when we're thinking about the relationship between people and spaces, it's helpful to consider this kind of full spectrum of emotions that can happen in space and time. So something like space, which seems like an abstract term, but as we've looked at it, can mean a whole host of particular discourses. So it doesn't have an inherent scale, but is it created through and by the emotional attachment that human beings connect to the space. This kind of approach to doing research, as I said, particularly in our course, thinking about the ways that drag comes out of a particular time and place. There's different drag communities, but they all are, prior to things like Drag Race, very much associated with the gay bar. And so, if we're going to be considering the ways that the more mainstreaming of drag has impacted queer culture, we need to be thinking about, okay, what do those changes look like in relationship to queer spaces like the gay bar? And so we want to be employing an intersectional analysis. And I'm speaking particularly just to intersectional theory. So sometimes it's used descriptively, but I'm thinking specifically in terms of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist legal scholar. This piece comes from 1990, and I'm sure many of you have read it, but it's always taking into account that different people will have different experiences and will experience different spaces differently. Um, it's it may seem like an obvious thing, but when we start to think about community history and we are trying to access the shared and felt experience of a place, it won't be one unified expression. And so if, say, you were to focus on a group of people or a subcategory within queer and trans community that has only a positive association with that space, you're missing other voices within that larger community. Those voices become silenced or become unheard, rather. And the meanings that spaces have change over time. And then, of course, this kind of brings in the idea of the way that the notion of the generation or different generations of queer people will experience these so-called iconic spaces like Stonewall in very different ways. This is also speaking to larger conversations within history. So, of course, history is a very, very broad discipline and has many different, um, sub fields within it and many different approaches. And and this course really takes looking at history from an intersectional feminist queer perspective. It's There's still this larger conversation about what is history. And that really shapes, if we ask that question and we think about the aspects of history that we want to prioritize, that inevitably will shape what we understand as history. So, do we think that there is this history that is rooted in some truth claim that lies outside of human meaning? Um, and this is one of these larger questions that has been particularly kind of dismantled in the past 50 years, post war kind of context, where you get people within a number of disciplines, mostly within the humanities, challenging the idea of history, and particularly the narratives of, these great white men who are exploring and conquering using that kind of like colonialist language, or the histories of larger nations or political and military histories, things like that focus on very specific voices. So this has kind of been a crisis for the discipline of history, hence why we're following a more intersectional perspective. And in the 1970s, when women's studies departments started to kind of pop up in universities, there were a lot of questions about how to write women's history. And it's not as if women have not been included in history or that women don't shape history. It is thinking about the ways that women's voices have been unheard in specific ways, but also it gets us to challenge how history is made and remembered, how it's passed on. And of course, it has to do with, this larger cultural focus on whose voices are deemed to be important or worthy to listen to. So early scholars of women's history have had to read against the grain to find many voices, to find some women's histories, particularly working class women of color. And then we get more of a postmodern critique that in started to kind of challenge historians to think about what does the category woman mean in history, because it's not a stable concept. Um, the idea of what it means to be a woman, coming from a perspective of larger cultural norms, has changed over time and is different throughout in different cultural contexts. So these are just a number of debates. I'm not presenting all of them attached to particular theorists, and you by no means have to have these memorized, but it's just kind of getting you to think about the different questions that we can ask when we study history, the different things that we can focus on in order to, particularly when we're doing histories of so-called marginalized communities, voices of people, so-called, they would say voices from below, history from below, um, and thinking about the power dynamics that are that lay in that shift to looking at and prioritizing the voices of people who don't hold um, kind of normative positions of power.